I had a really hard time deciding which topic to ask her to give because she also speaks about horse racing. And my husband was just saying yesterday, I wish she would bring a horse. But today she's going to talk about her parents' love story. Robin Williams is an award-winning journalist, author, and storyteller. She's a baby boomer, like most of us, who grew up in Lynchburg, Virginia, listening to her parents talk about life in World War II. The stories of her parents' exotic global courtship inspired her to write her latest book, The Last Romantic War. She holds a master's degree in creative writing and spent 5 years as a feature writer at Richmond Times-Dispatch. She's the author of 3 other books, including 2 collections of humorous essays and a novel set at Colonial Downs Racetrack. She'll be speaking to us about life during the war, both at home and overseas, with a connection to Kilmarnock. And you all should go see her exhibit afterward. It's really interesting.
I enjoyed your comments about creating your characters and certainly nonfiction writing. I found the fun thing is to create all these characters and then put them in a setting and just watch what they do. I feel like I'm sort of really watching the movie and writing it down. So, yeah, I think writers do all share that pleasure. I'm going to start with it. As Denise pointed out, I do have a Kilmarnock connection. My cousin Poppy is here. And her dad was my mother's brother. And the book covers really the whole family, so his story is in there too. The world has changed dramatically in the last few months with the advent of the war in Ukraine. And as I was going over my notes, I was struck by the similarities with World War II and the war in Ukraine. Bombed out buildings look like bombed out buildings, and desperate women and children fleeing destruction, heroic soldiers, and brave civilians fighting for freedom against brutal forces of a dictator. It is a sobering scene, and it reminds us that freedom requires constant vigilance and sacrifice. And I always start my talk by thanking the veterans in the audience and their families who have made so many sacrifices that we could live in the greatest, freest nation that has ever existed. This is a great country, and Americans are the most generous, open-hearted people on earth. Look at all the private companies and individuals, not just the government, who are rushing support to the brave Ukrainians. And in the same way, 70 years ago, Americans went all over the world to fight the scourge of socialism and fascism and Marxism. And my book takes a look at the lives of that generation and their contributions to a free world. The Last Romantic War covers the drama of World War II and the drama and romance of my parents' exotic courtship during the war. They met on a blind date shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Dad proposed that night and Mom accepted. But they were a long ways from the altar. And after a whirlwind courtship, they had a misunderstanding. Mom sent the ring back, and Dad went to fight the Japanese in Burma for 2.5 years. And Mom went to Washington to work in the war effort and fell in love with a spy, one of ours. The Last Romantic War is how Flo and Bo fell in love at the beginning of the war and then went their separate ways for the duration. also a look at what it was like to live through the war if you were a young American. And it covers the lives of Mom's family and Dad's family. Their siblings were all involved in World War II. The book grew out of my love of adventure stories and listened to Dad talk about all his adventures in the jungle in Burma. He served under General Stilwell in the CBI, the China-Burma India Theater of War, which is a forgotten theater. Forgotten, that is, by everybody except the loyal children of most Whittaker kids were raised on Iwo Jima and Pearl Harbor and Omaha Beach and the Battle of the Bulge. But my brothers and I were raised on the Hukong Valley and Jambabu, Michina, and the Irrawaddy River. We heard about monsoons and malaria and leeches. There are a lot of leeches. And we thought the biggest part of World War II was fought in Burma. So it was always very strange to, see movies and history lessons, and they were all about Europe. And the war in the Pacific was nary a mention of Burma. And yet, as I was to discover in my research, it was a vast adventure. So, for somebody like me who was raised on Tarzan and Black Stallion and Rudyard Kipling, the true life adventure of the Burma Campaign was really intoxicating. Burma, as I'm sure you all know, was a British colony. And the Burma Campaign was actually fought by 30,000 Chinese troops and 1.5 million troops from around the United Kingdom. There were a few small special ops units who were American, but that's why we don't hear much about the Burma Campaign, because American soldiers were not doing the bulk of the fighting. The point of the Burma Campaign was to get supplies to China and keep China engaged in the war on the side of the Allies. China had been surrounded by Japan at that time, and their only access to the outside world was across North Burma into India, across the lower end of the Himalayas, where for a long time we flew an airlift, flying the hump, they have heard that term, until a land bridge could be opened up. Stilwell recruited a handful, a dozen or so, American officers to go train Chinese troops for the reconquest of Burma. And my father was one of those. He spent a year in India training troops, and then went into Burma as a liaison for Stilwell, embedded with the Chinese troops that he had trained. And altogether, he spent 2.5 years overseas. So his was not the Band of Brothers experience. He lived with Chinese officers, he learned to speak Chinese, he ate rice 3 times a day with chopsticks. It was very exotic. He rode elephants and camels and ate python meat. He socialized with native royalty and received as gifts a bag of jade from the Burmese jade mines and 2 samurai swords that had been captured. He carried a plug of opium around to barter with the natives. He suffered malaria, hacked his way through bamboo and elephant grass, survived a hand grenade. It was war. He dodged death on numerous occasions. The more I listened to Dad's stories, the more I thought the grandchildren have got to hear this. But when I proposed writing a book, my parents both dismissed the idea. Dad said, "Oh, I didn't do anything heroic." And Mom said, "Oh, everybody got married that way." But everybody didn't get married that way. And even without conspicuous heroism, service in Burma was, risky, exotic, and fascinating. So I recorded about 30 hours of my dad telling his stories. And then I spent 2 years researching the war, the Burma Campaign. Went to the National Archives. Found, fortunately these days, I was able to find a tremendous amount of material online. I read every book written in English by any veteran of the Burma Campaign. And I went overseas to many of the places he went. Sounds like the list of where Lynn went to. The Middle East, India, Burma, Australia, New Zealand, all of which was part of Dad's around the world travels. Then I spent years writing and rewriting, trying to figure out how to tell this story, this huge story, and to capture the feelings of the characters, but also the feel of the war. And it was really overwhelming. And I wrote 3 entirely different versions of this book. And it turned out that the solution was to listen to the tapes, listen to Dad telling the story in his own words. My dad was a storyteller. He was always telling anecdotes and stories about his life, often with self-deprecating humor. He talked about growing up in a small town in South Carolina during the Depression. Somehow he made that sound funny. and of course his adventure stories about being in Burma during the war. And in later years he joked about all his speeding tickets. And then he heard a lot of those. But far and away, his favorite story was how he met and married Flo Neer. We children wrote so many times we can all recite it verbatim. He would start out, you know, Flo and I met on April Fool's Day, as if we had not heard that 100 times. And then he would launch into this account of meeting her on a blind date and how they agreed that night to get married. He always told the story as though he were seeing her again, sashaying across the parking lot at the Officers Club at Fort Benning. It was the beginning of a love story that he savored for more than 60 years, and he often told it with a touch of wonder that the story ended the same way every time. The hero gets the girl. So, while I set out to document Dad's adventures in Burma, the book evolved, as Lynn can tell you, books do. And it became the story that he loved to tell, of a great global love affair, writ large against the vast backdrop of a world war. While Dad shared his stories with me verbally, Mom gave me her diaries, her scrapbooks, and sat down and gave me her memories. She was of the generation that kept scrapbooks and diaries, and I have them all. I know everything my mother did every day for about 5 years. It's really amazing. And if the scrapbooks weren't falling to pieces, I would bring them to show you. But the more I explored life on the home front during the war, I found that was just as interesting as life in the jungle. World War II ushered in a period of great social change, as frequently happens with a war. Of course, the starter was that the mobilization effort finally pulled the country out of the Depression. We built, these statistics are amazing, we built 325,000 airplanes, 88,000 tanks, and 1,400 warships. That'll pump up your economy. But all of that was in just 3 or 4 years, plus millions of bullets and boots and uniforms and sea rations. Then you had 12 million men, mostly men, in uniform. You had 12 million men in uniform all over the world, which meant a big portion of that generation became world travelers. I mean, everybody especially young people. But in the 1930s, people did not travel like that. People never expected to go abroad. People didn't think they were going to leave their own state. So that was a big deal. Another change was integration of the armed forces, which grew out of the war effort and really took off after the war. And finally, although no one suspected it at the time, asking women to take the jobs of the men who were overseas led to a permanent change in social attitudes. This seems amazing to me, but women couldn't work in government jobs before the war. They weren't open to that. And so the powers that be had to launch a publicity campaign to assure women and their families that it was socially acceptable to go to work. And not only that, the country needed it. Of course, the men who created this publicity campaign all privately agreed that when the war was over, the men would come home and take their jobs, and the women would go back to the country. And we all know how that worked out. My mother was one of those who benefited from this change in attitudes, and after she and Dad broke their engagement, she went to Washington and she worked for Lynn, and she met and dated lots of Army and Navy officers. You know, young people today especially can't imagine this, but in the 30s and 40s, no one went steady until they got engaged or married. A date was a casual thing. And it was expected that boys and girls would go out with lots of different people. There was this idea that you dated lots of men, and when you found a good one, then you got married. For young women especially, their social life was their job, plus it was fun. During the war, even as women went to work and liked it, marriage was still the goal. The whole country was in flux. Young men joined the service and moved all over the country, obviously meeting new people. Young women went to work, and many of them moved around the country as well, meeting new people. Weddings became the growth industry in the country, along with building munitions. And from 1939 to 1942, marriages went up 30%. In my mother's memories of wartime, two things stand out about the move of the country. One was the unity of purpose, and two was the uncertainty about what tomorrow would bring. Mom said everywhere you went, there was clearly this feeling of we're all in this together. And people would help each other in very spontaneous ways. But there was also a pervasive cloud of fear hanging over the country. When will this be over? Who will be taken next? And who will win? Of course, we know today how the war came out, but in 1943 and 44, there was a great deal of uncertainty about what the outcome would be. There were war planners who thought the war would go on at least through 1947, possibly 1948. America had disarmed completely at the end of World War I, which was only 20 years earlier. It's hard to believe how unprepared the country was for this war. My father was in the class of 1939, which provided the bulk of field officers for the war in Clemson. And he recalled drilling troops at Fort Moultrie, South Carolina, using wooden sticks for rifles because they didn't have weapons. He bought ammunition out of his own pocket to practice on the rifle range. And when he was sent to Louisiana for the big War Games exercise in 1941, he said the Army hired people, private people with little small private planes, Piper Cubs, to fly over and throw paper bags of flour out the cockpit to simulate bombs. And he wrote home to his parents, "I hope this pitiful army never has to take the field." In such a stressful and uncertain environment, people adopted an attitude of live for today. And they crammed a lot of social activity in their lives in a sort of frenetic way. Big band dancing became the escape, swing dancing, the energetic way to take your mind off the fear and the uncertainty. One of the fascinating things for me about the World War II era is how glamorous so much of the life was. None of this jeans and popcorn at the movies, although everybody went to the movies. And the movies were part of a glamorous escape. If you go back and look at any of those movies from the 30s and the 40s, and they cranked out hundreds of them, they all have the same plot. It's always a Cinderella story, and this poor girl from the country comes to the big city to make enough money to save the homestead or whatever, and she's living in some terrible apartment with no heat, and she can't afford the rent, and she's literally starving, but she has a knockout, glamorous wardrobe. The whole thing, everywhere. So dancing on the screen and in real life was really the rage. And the big bands played everywhere, from roadhouses to the big hotels, 4 and 5 nights a week. It wasn't just a Saturday night thing. And people dressed up. You know, it's not too hard to imagine dressing up to go to a dance at the Shoreham Hotel in Washington. But Mom said even in high school, when they went to a dance, the girls wore cocktail dresses and sometimes long dresses, and the boys all wore tuxedos. And the colleges all had several weekends a year of formal dances where the big bands came, Glenn Miller and Artie Shaw and Duke Ellington. Recently, as I was going through some of my mother's things, I found a little chest that had 37 pairs of gloves. So, you know, mostly leather and kid, but really every fabric, every color. And not only that, she had 3 gorgeous pairs of elbow-length kid gloves. And I brought some of them here. Imagine having the kind of social life that was so busy that you needed multiple pairs of elbow-length gloves. World War II was the biggest event of my mother's generation, and like a lot of young women, she spent that time being fussed over by men in uniform. And we all know that a uniform automatically makes a man handsome and dashing. While a lot of women, like my mother, had jobs during the war, women also contributed to the war effort just by being in some way the ideal wholesome American womanhood that men were fighting for. You didn't have to be a pinup girl like Rita Hayworth to inspire the troops and the morale of the fighting men. Young men were fighting for ideals of freedom, yes, but in a very elemental way. They were fighting to come home to their wives and girlfriends. And, you know, that's why so many of them proposed just as they were getting on the troop ship. It became a patriotic duty for my mother and the other women in her generation to write letters to men overseas. And there were organized campaigns to connect women to the soldiers and sailors. And of course, not surprisingly, a lot of them came home and married the gal they formed a relationship with through the mail. My mother corresponded with at least a dozen men, as far as I can tell from her scrapbooks, including eventually my father. He reached out through the mail to try to repair the rift. But imagine how challenging it must have been for Dad, and for soldiers everywhere, to conduct a courtship when it took a letter 3 weeks to get home, and 3 weeks to get a reply. Do you still love me? There's a famous scene in that movie American Sniper about Chris Kyle, played by that darling Bradley Cooper. And he's in his sniper position in Iraq, and he's on a cell phone talking to his wife back home. You know, there was no such luxury in World War II. No Facebook, no telephone, no email. And you're gone for 2 or 3 years. Dad sent Mom a bracelet from India in the fall of 1943 that arrived in the spring of 1944. Despite all these and many other challenges to their courtship, Flo and Bo somehow ended up together. But not until they had both examined every other possibility first. And not until they had both dodged a lot of bullets and traveled a circuitous route of dance floors and global airfields. This book is a memoir of a relationship that unfolded at a very particular time in history. It's also a look at the era, what it was like to live through the war if you were young Americans. After all, Flo and Bo's love story cannot be separated from the great global conflict they shared. Their courtship would not have unfolded as it did had they not met at the precise moment of America's entrance into the war. 6 months earlier, or a couple of years later, their story would not be remarkable. The war brought them together, and the war kept them apart. The war dictated how they communicated and what they did during the years they were apart. And the war made both of them stronger. Not only did wartime events impact the course of their romance, the wartime environment imprinted both of them with memories of the most exciting and romantic time of their lives. They fell in love against the stimulating, patriotic backdrop of war bond rallies, troop trainings, a revving economy, and frenetic big band music. The world and society both opened up during the war, affording young men and women of that generation wildly unexpected experiences. My father left a small backwater village in the South and traveled all around the world. My mother left the circumscribed life of a small-town Southern girl and went to work in a big city. It was romantic and exciting to do one's part, to save the world for freedom, and afterwards to rejoice together in homecomings and victory. For America, it was the last romantic war. Thank you. We'll take some questions if you want, or I can read a piece of the book. I don't know what our timetable is like. Tell me what you want. Denise?
Do you all have particular questions you'd like to ask, or would you rather have individual conversations with Robin? I think maybe they should see your exhibit.